the clock just hit 0. The NBA didn't whisper this one, it exploded. Breaking news ripped through the league like a late-night Woj bomb. Chris Paul is back, and he's headed north. In a chaotic 3-team deal involving the Clippers, the Nets, and the Raptors, one of the most polarizing point guards of this generation just flipped the entire conversation around the Eastern Conference. And if you think this is just another veteran pickup, you're already missing the real story. Because this trade isn't about numbers on a stat sheet. It's about time, pressure, and unfinished business. For months, Chris Paul had been labeled everything except what he actually is. Too old, too fragile, a locker room problem, a scapegoat for situations that were already broken long before he walked in. And now, suddenly, the same league that questioned his value is watching him land on a Raptors team that has been quietly punching above its weight all season. Toronto didn't just add a player. They added a voice, a floor general, a guy who knows exactly what chaos feels like when the playoffs tighten and the margin for error disappears. This Raptors squad has had flashes of brilliance, moments where they looked ahead of schedule, moments where coaches wish they had someone on the floor who could calm everything down without calling a timeout. Now they do. But here's where it gets interesting. Chris Paul isn't coming in grateful. He's coming in motivated. This is a fresh-minded, highly competitive version of CP3-1 who feels like the league counted him out too early. And historically, that's when he's at his most dangerous. When the narrative flips from, can he still do it, to watch me prove it. And this move doesn't live in isolation. It's part of a much bigger storm forming across the NBA. One where veteran stars, front offices, and franchises are all racing against the same enemy, the clock. Trades are lining up, patience is gone, and legacies are on the line. So before we go any further, where are you watching from right now? If you're in the US, press 1 inch, the comments. If you're watching from anywhere else in the world, press 2. And while you're there, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next, because this story is just getting started. Why Toronto made this move. Now, at first glance, this trade feels safe, conservative, almost boring. A veteran point guard nearing the twilight of his career, joining a young team still defining itself. But if you look closer, this move is anything but safe. It's intentional, calculated, and quietly aggressive. The Raptors didn't make this deal because they're desperate. They made it because they're ahead of schedule. This season, Toronto has been one of the league's most confusing teams in the best way possible. On paper, they weren't supposed to matter. Too young in some spots, too inconsistent in others, but night after night, they kept showing something you can't fake. Structure under pressure. They competed, they closed games, and when they lost, they didn't fold. What they didn't have was a stabilizer. That's where Chris Paul comes in. Not to dominate the ball, not to put up vintage numbers, but to control moments. The Raptors have talent that pops early in games, but late game execution, playoff possessions, and emotional swings are a different animal. That's where CP3's value lives. He sees the floor like a coach. He anticipates chaos before it happens. And let's be honest, this team needed someone who could talk, someone who could pull guys aside without it becoming personal, someone whose resume speaks louder than any locker room speech. When things get uncomfortable, Chris Paul doesn't flinch. He's lived there. There's also something else nobody wants to say out loud. Toronto didn't just trade for leadership, they traded for accountability. When you bring in a player like this, excuses disappear. Practice habits change. Late game mistakes get addressed immediately. The bar rises, whether you're ready or not. And for a team trying to earn respect in a crowded Eastern Conference, that matters more than another young prospect or future pick. This isn't about nostalgia. This is about sharpening an identity. Toronto believes they're closer than people think, and this move tells the league they're done waiting quietly. Because when a team brings in Chris Paul, they're not planning to rebuild. They're preparing to compete. The scapegoat narrative, nobody wanted to question. For years, Chris Paul has lived in one of the most uncomfortable spaces in sports. Respected, accomplished, and yet constantly blamed. Everywhere he's gone, the pattern feels familiar. If the season ends short of a championship, the microscope finds him. The injuries, the leadership style, the personality. Somehow, the conversation always circles back to CP3. And that's exactly why this moment matters. In recent seasons, Chris Paul became the easy answer to complicated problems. If things felt tense behind the scenes, it must be him. If a locker room didn't fully click, point to the veteran. If expectations weren't met, blame the guy with the loudest voice. But the truth is far less convenient. Teams don't fall apart because of one player. They fall apart because timelines don't match, roles aren't clear, or pressure exposes cracks that were already there. Now, for the first time in a while, Chris Paul walks into a situation without baggage. No last chance label, no savior expectations, no franchise asking him to be something he's not. Toronto isn't asking him to carry them, they're asking him to guide them. And that changes everything. This version of Chris Paul is dangerous because he's detached from the noise. He doesn't need validation anymore. He's not chasing numbers. He's chasing moments, tight games, late possessions, teaching opportunities that don't show up in box scores but decide playoff series. There's also a psychological edge here that people underestimate. When a player feels miscast or misunderstood, motivation hits differently. This isn't anger, it's clarity. Chris Paul knows exactly who he is at this stage, and when someone gives him a role that actually fits, the results tend to surprise people. Toronto didn't trade for the headline version of CP3. They traded for the one who's been quietly preparing for this exact reset. And when that kind of player steps into a young locker room that's still forming its identity, the ripple effects go far beyond one season. When veteran presence changes everything. There's a moment every young team hits that no stat can explain. The game slows down, the crowd gets louder, the margin for error disappears. And suddenly, talent alone isn't enough. This is where seasons quietly slip away or get redefined. Toronto has been flirting with that moment all year. They've had games where energy carried them early, where confidence built runs, where effort masked inexperience. But late in close games, when every possession feels heavier than the last, you could see it. The hesitation, the rushed decisions, the split-second doubts that separate good teams from playoff-ready ones. That's where a player like Chris Paul alters the ecosystem. Not with flashy plays, but with timing, with angles, with knowing when to push and when to slow everything down. Veteran presence isn't about speeches, it's about behavior under stress. Younger players watch how a veteran reacts after a bad call, a missed shot, a momentum swing, and they adjust without realizing it. What makes this fit so intriguing is that Toronto doesn't need Chris Paul to lead them emotionally. They already play hard, they already compete. What they need is refinement. A layer of professionalism that only comes from someone who's been through every version of postseason pressure imaginable. And here's the part most fans overlook. Coaches trust veterans differently. Rotations tighten faster, adjustments come quicker, accountability becomes clearer. When a coach knows there's a floor general on the court who sees the same things they do, the entire operation sharpens. This move doesn't guarantee playoff success. Nothing does. But it dramatically raises Toronto's margin for error. It gives them a safety net when games tilt toward chaos. And in the NBA, that's often the difference between learning the hard way and surviving long enough to matter. This trade was never just about Chris Paul. If you think this move only affects Toronto, you're not seeing the full board. NBA trades are rarely isolated, and this one sent quiet signals across the league the moment it broke. Because when a veteran like Chris Paul finds a new home, it forces everyone else to reevaluate their own timelines. For the Clippers and the Nets, this wasn't about winning headlines. It was about flexibility, about repositioning assets before pressure peaks. Teams in transition don't panic, they create options. And that's exactly what happened here. Picks move, contracts realign, cap sheets breathe again. This is the kind of trade that looks calm on the surface, but sets up louder moves behind the scenes. And around the league, front offices were watching closely. Why? Because this deal reinforces a trend that's becoming impossible to ignore. The NBA is splitting into two mentalities: teams that are still waiting and teams that have decided waiting is no longer acceptable. Toronto just told the league which side they're on. There's also a deeper message for star players. The league is shifting back toward valuing experience in moments that matter, not as a luxury, but as a necessity. Young talent is everywhere, but composure, that's still rare. And when the postseason comes, it's often the oldest voices in the room that decide how far a team really goes. This trade subtly raises the temperature across the Eastern Conference. Opponents now have to account for a Raptors team that won't beat itself late, a team that understands time, score, and situation. That alone changes scouting reports. And for teams sitting on the fence, unsure whether to push in or pull back, this move applies pressure, because the deadline waits for no one. Chris Paul didn't just land in Toronto. He became a reminder that the clock is ticking for everyone. The shadow of the deadline. Every NBA season reaches a point where the energy shifts. The games feel heavier, rumors get louder, phones start buzzing inside front offices at odd hours. That moment is right now. And the Chris Paul trade didn't calm the waters, it stirred them. Because when one veteran domino falls, everyone starts looking around to see who's next. Teams hovering in the middle of the standings are suddenly forced to answer uncomfortable questions. Are we building or are we competing? Are we protecting the future or chasing the present? Moves like this remove the illusion of patience. They expose intent. Toronto made theirs clear, and the rest of the league felt it immediately. This is where pressure separates organizations. Some franchises freeze, afraid of making the wrong move. Others lean into the chaos, understanding that indecision is its own kind of failure. The trade deadline doesn't reward caution, it rewards clarity. For players, this stretch is just as intense. Every game becomes an audition. Every performance might raise or lower value. Veterans feel it, young guys sense it. Coaches shorten leashes without saying a word. The league quietly transitions from long-term thinking to survival mode. And hovering over all of it is the same question every contender wrestles with. Do we have enough when it matters most? Chris Paul's arrival in Toronto sharpens that question for everyone else, because it reminds teams that experience can't be manufactured overnight. You either have it when the moment arrives or you don't. The deadline is approaching fast, and history shows us one thing every year. When the dust settles, the teams that acted decisively are the ones still standing. Everyone else is left explaining what they were waiting for. When legacy starts whispering. There's a point in every elite player's career when the noise fades and something quieter takes over. It's not fear, it's not doubt, it's awareness. The realization that time is no longer theoretical, it's visible, measurable, unforgiving. This is where Chris Paul is now. Legacy isn't built in highlight reels at this stage. It's built in decisions, in how you choose to spend the remaining miles on your body, in what rooms you walk into, and what influence you leave behind when the season ends. For veterans, the game becomes less about proving greatness and more about defining it. That's why this Toronto chapter matters so much. Chris Paul didn't choose comfort. He didn't choose obscurity. He chose relevance. He chose a team still forming its identity, still searching for clarity in the moments that matter most. And that choice says something about how he sees himself not as a footnote, but as a final punctuation mark. Young players don't always realize when they're sharing space with history, but they feel it in practice intensity, in film sessions, and the way mistakes get corrected immediately instead of later. That's how legacy transfers, not through speeches, but through standards. The Raptors now carry more than expectations. They carry responsibility, because when a veteran like this commits to your timeline, it raises a simple but uncomfortable question. What are you willing to match? The league is watching, not loudly, quietly, evaluating whether this was a symbolic move or a meaningful one. And for Chris Paul, the answer doesn't need to come fast. It just needs to come when it counts. The East just got uncomfortable. The Eastern Conference doesn't change overnight. It shifts slowly, almost invisibly, until one move forces everyone to adjust their posture. This trade did exactly that, not because it created a super team, but because it removed predictability. Toronto is no longer an easy night on the schedule. Before this move, opponents could rely on one thing. If the game stayed close late, pressure might do the work for them. Now that assumption is gone. Late possessions are different when there's a voice on the floor that has seen every coverage, every trick, every moment where panic ruins good basketball. And that makes teams uncomfortable. Contenders hate uncertainty more than talent. They can scout talent. They can game plan athleticism. What's harder to prepare for is composure, especially when it doesn't show up on tape. Chris Paul doesn't change Toronto's ceiling as much as he changes their floor. And in a playoff series, that matters more than people want to admit. This move also quietly reshuffles the mental hierarchy of the East. Younger teams chasing relevance now see Toronto as a measuring stick instead of a peer. Veteran teams circling deep runs know there's one more matchup where mistakes will be punished, not forgiven. And here's the real tension. This version of the Raptors has nothing to lose. Expectations are still low nationally. Pressure sits elsewhere. That's dangerous territory in the NBA, where teams play freer, smarter, and sharper because no one expects them to survive. The East didn't get louder today, it got tighter. And when the margins shrink, experience doesn't just help, it decides who's left standing. What happens if this actually works? This is the part nobody wants to say out loud yet. The uncomfortable what if. What if this trade doesn't just stabilize Toronto, but elevates them? What if the pieces click faster than expected? What if the Raptors don't just survive close games, but start winning the ones that used to slip away? Because if that happens, the league narrative changes quickly. Suddenly, this isn't a feel-good veteran story. It's a blueprint, a reminder that progress doesn't always come from youth alone. that sometimes the fastest way forward is to borrow perspective from someone who's already seen the road end badly and learn from it. If Toronto takes that next step, it forces front offices to revisit assumptions they've grown comfortable with. The idea that timelines must be extreme, that you're either rebuilding or contending with no middle ground. This team lives in that middle space, and this move challenges the idea that it's a dead zone. There's also a cultural ripple effect. Players talk, agents notice. When veterans see franchises that value their experience and place them in roles that actually fit, it changes where they're willing to go. It changes how younger stars evaluate organizations. Stability becomes currency again. But none of this is guaranteed. The NBA is unforgiving. Chemistry can't be rushed. Health always looms. And pressure has a way of exposing truths faster than optimism can cover them. That's why this stretch matters so much. The games ahead will quietly answer the biggest question of all. Was this move symbolic, or was it the start of something real? The real lesson behind this move, when the noise fades and the headlines move on, this trade leaves behind something far more valuable than speculation. It leaves a lesson one the NBA relearns every few years, then somehow forgets again. Basketball is not just about talent accumulation. It's about timing, about honesty, about understanding where you are before pretending to be somewhere else. Toronto didn't chase a fantasy. They didn't mortgage the future or panic their way into relevance. They made a human decision. They looked at a group that competes hard, exceeds expectations, and still struggles in the moments where experience matters most, and they address that exact weakness. No more, no less. For Chris Paul, this chapter isn't about redemption. It's about intention, about choosing impact over comfort, about showing that leadership doesn't expire just because the league gets younger. There is something deeply human in that choice, accepting where you are and still demanding meaning from it. For younger players, the lesson is simple but powerful. Greatness isn't just how you play when things are easy, it's how you think when things are tight, how you respond when pressure strips away excuses. Having someone around who has lived through those moments doesn't guarantee success, but it gives you a map when panic sets in. And for fans, maybe this is the reminder we all need. The league isn't just stars and contracts and rumors. It's people navigating ambition, loyalty, fear, and time just on a brighter stage. Whether this move leads to playoff wins or quiet growth, it was made with clarity. And in a league obsessed with speed, clarity is rare. If you believe basketball is bigger than box scores, bigger than hot takes, make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and share this video with someone who loves the game the right way. Drop a comment below. Do you think this move changes Toronto's future, or is it just a short-term play? Either way, the conversation doesn't end here. It's just getting started.